Welcome to Experiential Spirituality, episode 29, Lost to Time. As ever, you can follow me on Twitter through a link in the description box below. You can ask me anything through Curious Cat through a link in the description box below. And you can buy my book through a link in the description box below. On that subject, there's a hardback copy of the book coming out in the near future. I don't know when exactly, but that is coming soon, so that'll be something. I do prefer hardback books just because they last longer, but I don't know when that's going to be, but it is in the pipeline. So, in the past few episodes, I've talked quite a lot about the video games that I've been working on. I said before that I've got lots of video game ideas, and it's just a matter of choosing one and working on it. So, I've talked about the idea I had for a very simple game where it's a turn-based game where each turn you decide as the king of a kingdom what you want to do. You make decisions based on events that happen, and you try to use whatever resources you have at your disposal in terms of money, in terms of manpower to deal with issues. That's the simplest game idea I had. I talked about that. I also talked about Hero Camp, basically running a theme park for heroes. It's a very humorous game, and I think it's a great idea for a game. I then talked about the last time I did a live stream, which was the week before last. I talked about Justin the Avenger, which is a hack and slash game. So those are some of the game ideas I have, but what you'll notice about all of them is that none of them have anything to do with spirituality. They don't have anything to do with mysticism at all. And actually, there are elements in all of them that have to do with spirituality and mysticism, but for the most part, no, the point of them is not spirituality, the point of them is not mysticism. You know, it's kind of hard to take games like that and make them about spirituality or mysticism, and I think that whenever you're doing something, you've got to make the best product that you can. So if you're making a game, first and foremost, it's got to be a good game. That's what my focus always is, but actually, there is a game that is centered around spirituality in a way, and it's the game I'm going to talk about today. It's the game it's my main focus, essentially. And the reason I didn't talk about it before is that I couldn't. You see, there's a competition for someone to enter in a game idea, and there's going to be 3 winners chosen, and the winner will get a brand new laptop, and they'll get assistance from a professional game developer in making their game. So my chances of winning that competition are slim, but I thought I may as well enter it. Why not? I might as well take a chance. But that's why I haven't talked about this main idea of mine until now, because I hadn't yet entered into that competition. And it wouldn't be a smart idea to publicly talk about an idea I was planning to enter into a competition until I'd actually submitted that idea and made it official. One thing that's clear about this competition is that the idea remains yours. They're not allowed to take it from you. They're not allowed to say, sorry, you didn't win, but actually we're going to take your idea and make it ourselves. They're not allowed to do that. So the idea is mine. So now that I've submitted that entry, I want to talk about what that idea is. And I think the best way to do that would actually be to read you the description that I sent them, because you had to describe your idea in under 500 words. So I'm just going to read to you what I sent to them. Now, the game is called The Divine Council, Fate of the Fourth Epoch. So, those of you who are familiar with the things that I talk about may already have an idea of where this is going. But this is a very unique game idea. There are games you might think are comparable to it, but ultimately it's a very different experience. So here's the way I explained it to them. The Divine Council is a strategy/god game hybrid in which you assume the role of an archangel, waging a spiritual war that will involve heroes, monsters, bizarre technologies, and so much more. But while you have authority over awakened souls and angelic servants, as well as having numerous blessings and catastrophes that you may unleash, you yourself are ruled over by the heavenly archons, whose edicts even an archangel would be foolish to disobey. So this is where we get to the part where, because thus far you could think of a few god games that sound quite comparable, but here's where we get to the really unique take on the genre that I have for this game. I say the core problem with god games thus far is that they position you as divinity, yet have your concerns be the same as any human ruler. So let's take a game like one of the most obvious comparisons, a very old game, a game like Populous. It came out in the late 80s, I believe. There was a sequel in the early 90s. Populous has you being a deity, but in Populous you have a human tribe, and your goal is to control that tribe to eliminate all the other tribes, and you just happen to use god powers to do that. So that's the sense in which it's a god game. But obviously, given my own spirituality, that wouldn't be the way to do things. So here's my unique take on the genre, if you like. So I say the core problem with god games thus far is that they position you as divinity, yet have your concerns be the same as any human ruler. In the Divine Council, you must select one of 7 unique mythical nations, such as Atlantis and Iram. Iram, for those of you who don't know, is a lost city that's mentioned in the Quran, as your chosen people. Your priority is not their supremacy, but the enlightenment of as many souls as possible in order to save them from the coming cataclysm. Your chosen people are merely your initial conduit. So you can see the biblical influences coming in here, the Jews as the chosen people, then being then that gift being brought to the Gentiles as well. So you've got this all-encompassing grace, except this is set in prehistory. So you've got nations like Atlantis, Aram, Lemuria, Mu, and so forth. You do not have, this is another thing about it, you do not have direct control over your chosen nation or any other. They act autonomously, playing out an intricate strategy game. You may only direct those souls in the world that awaken to the reality of the divine, whichever nation they come from. These mystics can be deployed to influence the behaviour of nations in a host of ways. So for example, perhaps a nation is behaving aggressively, and so through a mystic you inspire them to adopt the worship of a peaceful deity, thus changing their behaviour. The more souls brought to enlightenment, the more influence you have. However, the more comfortable souls become, a situation made worse with civilizational advancement, the more apathetic to the divine they become, and so it is often necessary to engineer strife. Entire settlements may become decadent, at which point the Archons may insist that you destroy them utterly. This bestows an organic difficulty curve and prevents the late game ease that blights most strategy titles. So you can see how my own spirituality is reflected in the gameplay, and yet it works as a game. Because typically what happens in strategy, or in most games in fact, but especially in strategy games, is that the player becomes so powerful that the late game becomes boring because no one can challenge them. But by introducing this concept of decadence, this idea, which is absolutely true to life, that the more comfortable people become, the more comfortable a civilization becomes, the greater the chance of them becoming decadent and apathetic, and therefore the less chance they're going to pay attention to the divine, which in this game, because you, as an archangel, you're reliant on those souls in the world that awaken to the divine, that makes your job harder. So again, as I say, it lends the game a very organic difficulty curve, and it prevents that late game ease. So I continue on. By setting the game within a prehistoric concept, I can indulge my passion for spirituality and mythology and avoid religious sensitivities. That's key, because the last thing you want to do, well, you might do it for controversy, just for some cheap controversy, but not if you're serious. The last thing you want to do is have a game where you're presiding over the ministry of Yeshua, or presiding over the ministry of Moses, or the antics of the Prophet Muhammad, or something like that. It might be a good idea to stir up controversy, but it's not a good idea if you're trying to do things seriously. So I say, by setting the game within a prehistoric context, I can indulge my passion for spirituality and mythology and avoid religious sensitivities. Although I am the author of a book on mysticism, I have no interest in pushing my own views on spirituality or prehistory. My only priority is in utilising my intimate knowledge of those subjects to create a great game. I had to say that because obviously the first thing they're going to do when considering an entry is Google the people to see what they're saying on social media and things like that. And if they see that spirituality is my focus and that my game idea centers around spirituality, they might think to themselves, oh, this is one of those games that's going to be someone trying to push a religious message through it. So I had to emphasize, no, that's definitely not what this is, and it isn't. I've been an avid gamer for my entire life, and my future is as an independent developer that challenges convention. The most obvious game comparisons would be Populous and Black and White, but my biggest influences were actually ActRaiser, the Dominion series, and the Seven Kingdoms games. So that's the concept, and again, if you're familiar with my own perspective on things, and certainly if you've read my book, you'll see that my spirituality is all throughout that game, my own perspective is all throughout that game. It's kind of Old Testament, and that wasn't deliberate. Because obviously you've got the Divine Council in there, and obviously I don't think there's a Divine Council of Archons that's presiding over us, and this is what I meant by saying this is not me pushing my spirituality. First and foremost, it's got to be a fun game, but I want to make it as authentic as possible as far as spirituality is concerned. So you have the Divine Council, which is very Old Testament. A lot of these kind of games have you actually play as God, which I don't like. Not because it's blasphemous necessarily, although you could probably make an argument that it is, but because I don't think you could possibly make a game where you're playing an ineffable being. What would it mean to be God? And another problem is that in most games, even if they're God games, the player's power has to be limited somehow. If you're playing as God, that makes no sense. So these games typically have to contrive all of these reasons why, yeah, you're playing as God, but you can't do anything you want. In my game, you play as an Archangel, and theoretically, you can do anything you want. You can nuke the whole world if you want right at the start of the game. But, again, the goal of this game is not to ensure the supremacy of your chosen human nation. It's to save as many souls as possible. So yeah, you can nuke the whole planet from the start if you want, but it won't do you any good as far as your objective is concerned, because your objective is to save individual souls. And again, you can only directly influence those souls that awaken to the divine, those mystics, and you employ them in a number of ways to awaken more souls. And the point is, the way I've done it, I think is quite clever in the way that it relates to, again, real-world spirituality. Because, of course, the whole point of Yeshua's ministry in the New Testament was that he was trying to save as many souls as possible in the run-up to the destruction of Jerusalem at 70 AD. Now, here I have my game set in prehistory with all of these lost civilizations like Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu, and so forth, all of which were destroyed in some catastrophe or other. And so essentially, in this game, there's a countdown to this catastrophe. The catastrophe, just like the destruction of Jerusalem, it is going to happen. It's just a question of how many souls you as the player are able to save beforehand. So it's that same concept where you're in the end of days of this fourth epoch. And of course, different cultures around the world talk about the world going in different cycles, and you'll have one civilization and then it will be destroyed, then a new one will arise and so forth. By most accounts, the epoch that the Atlanteans lived in was the fourth epoch, and that's why the game is called The Divine Council, Fate of the Fourth Epoch. So you've got this last days concept going on, and you've got to save as many souls as possible. Sorry, my neighbour is doing something. He's always out in his garden doing something. I don't think he's actually actually got a specific project in mind. I think he just likes pottering about in his garden and doing stuff with no particular aim in mind. So that's the idea. And as I said, it turned out very Old Testament, but that wasn't intentional. It's just that when I sat down to think, okay, how do I first and foremost make a great game, and how do I imbue it with genuine spirituality, authentic spirituality, it just naturally came out very Old Testament. This idea that if a settlement becomes too decadent that it can't be saved, the Archons, in the case of this game, they would ask you to destroy it. Well, obviously that's very Old Testament, that's very Sodom and Gomorrah. But as in the biblical texts, you do receive prayers from humans on the earth. And so just as, for example, someone might pray for the salvation of Nineveh in the Old Testament, someone might pray for the salvation. So there's a lot of mechanics going on in this game is what I'm trying to say, and I'm very happy with it, but I do want to give it a disturbing aesthetic. When it comes to the Divine Council, for example, it would be very easy to just make them very, very angelic figures, but I've decided to go a bit more dark than that. I've made them halfway between angelic beings and halfway between Cenobites. So this competition, it allowed you to send in a screenshot if you happen to have done something on the game, you're allowed to send in a screenshot to showcase what the game will look like, if possible. So I sent them a screenshot, and I'm going to show it to you now. So you should be seeing the screenshot now. You can see the way it's set up like a strategy game. There's a primitive Atlantean settlement. You see each of the nations will go through different stages of civilization, primitive, advanced, and high. And again, the more they go through these stages of civilization, the more chance they'll become apathetic to the divine. But here we have a primitive Atlantean settlement. You can see here they've taken to worshipping an early bull deity, which causes them to emphasize combat. And here we have a band of Lemurians coming up to attack them. Now here we have this text because in the games at this point, the Atlanteans have just discovered orichalcum. Now, orichalcum is a real world thing. If you're familiar with the story of Atlantis as explained by Plato, Plato talked about orichalcum. It was at one point a real material, at least according to Plato and several others. And so I want to make the way I present these lost nations as authentic as possible to historical accounts. And so I'll explain the logic behind what this Archon says. This is one of the Archons, and I'll get to him in a moment. So when the Atlanteans discover orichalcum, this is what the Archon says. The Atlanteans have discovered orichalcum, a naturally occurring metallic alloy distinct for the way in which it glitters like red fire when light shines upon it. That's straight from Plato's description. Already the Atlanteans are producing coins, adorning buildings, and forging weapons of war with the substance, propelling their nation into a new era. Now, there's actually Plato didn't say that the Atlanteans made weapons out of orichalcum. I don't even know if orichalcum would have been a good substance to make weapons out of. But I'm making a video game here, and I want Atlantean troops with orichalcum armor and weapons, so... In time, usage of orichalcum will become so widespread throughout the Atlantean nation that to evoke the alloy's name will be to evoke Atlantis itself. Orichalcum will be lost to humanity 9,463 solar years after the destruction of Atlantis in the coming cataclysm. For now, however, the Atlantean people rejoice in its discovery and marvel at its potential applications. So, this is something else that I had to be conscious of when I'm designing this game, and I've got a 10-page design document on how this game is going to function, is that you're an archangel and your bosses are the Divine Council. You all exist beyond time, so how do we talk about time? Well, I think the best way would be solar years, because that makes sense on a planetary scale, and it would probably differ from how the human civilizations at that time counted time. So it's a good time scale to give the player understanding so that they're not completely confused, but to be somewhat unearthly. The archangel that you are and the Divine Council that rule over you, they're looking at things from a kind of a higher perspective. And you've got this weird juxtaposition where there are things happening presently in the game, like the Atlanteans have discovered orichalcum, but because you and these Archons exist beyond time, the Archon is straight up telling you, hey, this is what happens in the future. So many things about the future are set. This is what the Atlanteans will do with orichalcum. Atlantis will be destroyed. The question is, how many souls can you as the player save in the meantime? Which I think is a really interesting idea. So to return to this once more, I want to talk about this. It's not finished yet, but this is an Archon that I called the Chronicler. Rather than giving them each weird names, I gave them titles. This is the Chronicler. He's the keeper of the Akashic Records, which is essentially the glossary of the game. That's why he's imparting this information. And I've made the Archons in their design really messed up. Again, I could so easily have made them kind of angelic in a cheesy way, but I thought I'd give them a bit of edge and make them more nightmarish. Again, kind of Cenobite-like, the kind of entities you might see on some drug trip or other, or even in a very organic spiritual experience. So there's all kinds of symbology here. The point of this Archon is that he's the one who stores all of this information. He's the keeper of the Akashic Records. He knows everything, and that's why you've got no skull cap there, and his brain is glowing red, fiery hot, implying that there's a lot going on in there. You've got the eyes upturned. He is animated as well, by the way. You can't see it in the screenshot, but he is animated, and in the animated version, his eyes flicker like he's having a fit or a seizure of some kind because he's struggling to process the sheer amount of information he's contained. He's got no nose, because the purpose of the nose is to filter things, essentially. Your nose prevents you from inhaling things that you otherwise shouldn't, and the point of him having no nose, or her having no nose, is that there is no filter on this. This entity, this being, is absorbing information regardless of what it is. His lips are very female, but behind the lips is not darkness as you would naturally think, but rather light, thus conveying the fact that he bestows knowledge. Now, the symbology behind this serpent, this kind of golden serpent that's strapped to his head, well, that's biblical symbology. Because that serpent, like for example, when Moses is in the wilderness and his people are attacked by these serpents, Moses raises a serpent of his own and he defeats the serpents on the ground, because the serpent is symbolic of the raising of consciousness. This is why in the Gospel of John, when Yeshua is speaking about his own crucifixion, he compares his own raising up on the cross to Moses raising up the serpent in the wilderness. And it's because, again, the serpent is symbolic. In those instances, the serpent is symbolic of a raising of consciousness. And so the reason this Archon has this serpent strapped to his head is because his duty, his role, is to keep the Akashic records. His focus is on intellectual information. It's not on the spiritual. And so the idea behind this kind of head strap here is that he has to be artificially connected to the divine, because he's so focused on intellectual information. If he's not somehow artificially connected to the divine, like through this device here, then he'll be lost. So when you know symbology, as I do, it's not actually difficult to create some really disturbing imagery. Because if you know a lot of ancient symbology and the way that it's used, you can just combine it and you can have a really bizarre or unsettling looking figure, and yet there'll be a reason for them to look bizarre. He's not just weird for the sake of it. His weirdness has a purpose behind it. And so that's the game I'm making. That's the main game I'm making. That is the game that does revolve around spirituality. But again, it does first and foremost have to be a good game to play. So this is kind of tricky on a technical scale, this game, because again, you don't actually directly control any of the nations, not even your chosen nation. You can again only direct those souls in the world that awaken to the divine. So it's not that you as an archangel are limited in power, it's just that it's part of the divine rules that you don't speak to those who aren't awakened to your presence. And that's the way that in this God game, the player's power is limited, but in a way that actually makes sense. It's not just some contrivance to prevent the player nuking the whole planet from the beginning. The player can nuke the whole planet if they want, but there's a good reason for them not to be able to directly control everyone. So what that means in technical terms is that these different AI nations are playing out a strategy game, and then on top of that strategy game, you've got this God game layer where the player is interacting with the world as this archangel who is ruled over by the divine council. Now the player will have angelic servants as well, because the way the hierarchy works in my game is you've got God, who is not present. It just seems wrong to bring God into a game. God is mentioned obviously, but he doesn't factor into the gameplay. How do you have an ineffable being factor into gameplay? You can't. But the point is, you've got God, the divine council, you as the archangel, and the angels below you. That's the way it works. So what I've done in terms of the technical design of the game is that right now I'm just making a strategy game. It's just a strategy game. I'm making it as if the player is just going to play a normal strategy game. So it's got definite rules, and all I'm doing is coding the AI to be able to play by those rules. So if you were to look at my design documents, it will look initially like I'm making a strategy game, because I know the best thing to do is to make this strategy game, teach the AI to play it well, and then have the God game mechanics on top of that. So this is no small project, but that's what I'm working on now. I'm very enthusiastic about it, and I've been super busy in the last week with doing that and all kinds of other things. I really want to enter that competition. But yeah, that's the game idea I've got, and I am really enthusiastic about it. Because as I said in my blurb to the company, this competition, it does allow me to indulge my favourite things. You know, it allows me to indulge in spirituality. It allows me to indulge my love of mythology and prehistory, and it allows me to create a video game. So it's really the perfect project for me. And yeah, I think I'll move on from that. So the week before last, I started talking about going through the David Bowie albums. I started with the first one, which is called Space Oddity, or just David Bowie. This week it's The Man Who Sold the World, which is an album that is really well known, mostly because of the track referred to in the title, The Man Who Sold the World. Famously, of course, Nirvana did a cover of The Man Who Sold the World, and a lot of individuals, even Bowie fans, prefer the Nirvana version. Now, I was never a huge fan of Nirvana, but I'm not the kind of fan, you know, just because I'm a fan of David Bowie, I'm not. It's possible that Nirvana's version is superior. I don't know. But I don't want to talk about The Man Who Sold the World. As I said the week before last, when I talk about these Bowie albums, I'm almost always going to be talking about the more obscure tracks that I really like. And so the first track in this case on The Man Who Sold the World, and one that's linked in the description box below, is Savior Machine. Now, this is highly interesting, this track. This is where we get the first glimpse of Bowie's kind of dystopian nightmares, his concerns about the future, because the Savior Machine is a song about the world creating a machine designed to solve all of their problems, essentially. So it cures poverty, it cures disease and all that. But what happens is that this machine, being sentient, it grows bored, and it threatens to start wars and things like that just out of its boredom. And there's some really lovely lyrics in it. Like at one point, the machine is begging the humans to just start a war or do something. The machine complains that life is too easy. And at one point, the machine refers to the material realm as the sacred dimension of time. So already you're beginning to see some of Bowie's influences, because Bowie was an intellectual guy. He studied a lot of things, and this is where we first see his more obscure occult influences coming in. But what's really interesting about this song for the present day is that the opening lyric is, President Joe once had a dream. The president that conceives of the Savior Machine is called Joe. President Joe once had a dream. The world held his hand. What's the rest of it? The world held his hand, something, and that's how the Savior Machine was built. So it's linked in the description box below. The second song I want to talk about from the album is the last song on the album, called The Superman, and this is where we get the first hints of Bowie's interest in Friedrich Nietzsche, essentially, because obviously Nietzsche talked about the Superman and so forth. And we also get the first hint of Bowie's own interest in prehistory, because when Bowie sings about the Superman in this last track, he's less speaking about some kind of a future man that is going to arise, or that could arise, and he's more speaking about a class of man that existed in times forgotten. So obviously it's a song that really appeals to me, because as I just said, I'm really interested in prehistory and things like that. So those two tracks are linked below, Savior Machine and The Superman. I was listening to a different kind of music this week, and in order to explain how I became a fan of this kind of music, I need to explain something about my childhood that I don't think I've ever talked about in the last 15 years on YouTube, or at least not to any great extent. But this week I was listening to a lot of Ice-T and Ice Cube, because I'm actually a huge fan of their work. And that's kind of strange, given that, you know, I was born and live in a small Highland town in Scotland. But here's what happened. So it's story time now. In fact, this episode is going to be quite story heavy, I should imagine. So when I was a kid, I don't know, how old would I have been? I don't know, 10? Yeah, I must have been 10, 11, 12 when I knew this guy. When I was a kid, I have one older sister. And, let's see, I think I've got a... Give me a second. I think somewhere... there we go. Okay, I'll have to do this manually. This is what happens when you have the mouse buttons changing the OBS screen. So here's me and my sister. That's us in one Christmas. So I have one sister, her. Now, when I was a kid, she had this boyfriend called Matthew, and me and Matthew got on amazingly well. Like, he was like my big brother essentially, but he was a bit of a rogue, to say the least. You know, he tended to get in trouble with the law a lot, but he just introduced me to so many different things, and one of those things was gangster rap, because he was a huge fan of gangster rap, and he loved Ice-T and Ice Cube and 2 Live Crew and Public Enemy and things like that, and he introduced me to their music, much to my mum's annoyance and much to my sister's annoyance, but he introduced me to their music, and I particularly liked Ice-T and Ice Cube. As a kid, I didn't understand, I thought, is there some relation between them? Is there some reason they're both called Ice something? Now I know there isn't, it's just a coincidence. I know why they're called those things, but as a kid, I just really liked their music. In fact, there's one album that I listened to again this week that Matthew introduced me to when I was a kid. It's Ice-T 6, Return of the Real, and it's not a very popular album, even among Ice-T fans, but I loved it as a kid, and I listened to it this week, and for me it still stands up. I still love the album. But there's one song on that, I believe it's track 14, called They Want Me Back In, and Matthew and I, we loved that song when I was a kid. And one day, we played that song when my mum and my sister were out. We played that song on full blast, on loop, all day long. We're just sitting there playing video games. The neighbours must have hated us. But I'll link to that track in the description box below. Ice-T, They Want Me Back In. And yeah, I remember, because Matthew and I used to play video games together and things like that. And I remember one occasion, because I'd heard all these rap songs and things like that, I was learning about a culture that, obviously living in the Highlands of Scotland, I knew nothing about. If it wasn't for listening to that rap music, I wouldn't know what a drive-by shooting was, as a kid. But one day I was through on my own in the computer room, as it was. I was playing Syndicate Wars, which is a sequel to a game called Syndicate. And in Syndicate, you control these agents, and you have to do all these missions for this corporation, essentially. But one thing you can do in it is drive cars. And having learned what a drive-by was from these rap albums, I successfully managed to pull off a drive-by shooting in Syndicate Wars. And as a little kid, I ran through to my sister's room where Matthew and my sister were, and I said, "Hey Matthew, I managed to pull off a drive-by shooting in Syndicate Wars." And obviously Matthew started pissing himself laughing, and my sister went mental. She was like, "Matthew, what happens if he grows up to be a criminal because you're letting him listen to these records?" But it was very funny at the time. But as a kid, quite innocently, I would go around just uttering these rap lyrics, not knowing any better. And Matthew was always like, don't say those lyrics out loud. Don't, especially not in front of your mum, and things like that. But that's how I got into Ice-T and Ice Cube. And like I said, this week I was listening to the albums that I remember from back in those days, and they still stand up as far as I'm concerned. But I also listened to Ice-T and Ice Cube's later material, which I hadn't heard, because obviously in the last few years I've been focused on other things. And their new material is very good as well. I was just about to say, Tate, Ice-T's heavy metal band Body Count. This week I watched a concert that Body Count did in Germany in 2019. Now Ice-T's pretty old now, but he can still he can still play. He's still got a lot of energy. So yeah, that's how I got into Ice-T and Ice Cube. So if you were ever wondering, how I became the fly-ass gangster you see before you, someone who's able to drop science and still keep it real, well, there's the story. Bugsy says, I'm 15 minutes behind listening whilst building a room in the back garden. This is a perfect accompaniment. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I hope the sound of next door's lawnmower isn't too overpowering. It's not ideal timing on my neighbour's part, I have to say. But in thinking about my childhood, I also got thinking about something else, which is not from my childhood. This was from when I was 21. So 15 years ago now. I'm 37 next Sunday. It's my birthday next Sunday. But this was back when I was 21. I used to mention this now and then here on YouTube. I lived with 2 Polish girls, well 3 ultimately, in a flat down in Glasgow when I was at university. I lived with a Chinese couple. I lived with 2 Polish girls initially. Now, I've mentioned them on YouTube before, but enough time has elapsed now where I can really get into a bit more detail about what was going on back in those days, because I haven't spoken to any of them in years, so it's kind of old history that I can talk about more now. But, so I was living in this flat with this Chinese couple and these 2 Polish girls. Now, the Chinese couple, they pretty much kept to themselves. They were in charge of taking rent. They didn't own the place or anything, but they were the ones that organised the rent, took rent from everyone and gave it to the guy who did own the building. So the Chinese couple pretty much stayed in a room, and they were like fresh from China. It's not like they were ethnically Chinese. They were actually fresh from China. And so the kind of food they kept in the fridge and that they produced, it wasn't Western food at all. Honestly, I'm not being funny here, but sometimes I would open the fridge and I could not identify what that was. I didn't know what it was. On occasion, they would have Chinese friends around and they'd sit around eating this food, and I didn't know. To this day, I don't know what it was. So they pretty much kept themselves in their room, and I associated mostly with these 2 Polish girls, Magdalena and Anna. Now, it was great for the first while because here I am, 21, and I'm living with these 2 really gorgeous Polish girls. But things took a downturn at one point because they fell out with each other, and that just ruined the atmosphere. It made it so awkward. And what happened was that Anna had done something really... It was just a pathetic little squabble at first. Anna had done something minor to annoy Magdalena. And Magdalena was writing an email to some friend back in Poland. And in that email, she was complaining about Anna. And unfortunately, Anna saw what she was saying in the email. And they fell out and didn't speak to each other, refused to speak to each other. Which made things awkward for me because I was friends with both of them. And we used to hang around together, sit down, watch films and go out and things like that. But after that point, it was so awkward because if I was nice to one, the other would get annoyed at me. Like, I remember one night Anna was out at work, and so me and Magdalena were just sitting watching a film. Anna came in, and deathly silence. If I say hi to Anna, as I'm naturally inclined to do, I'm going to annoy Magdalena. Obviously, if I ignore Anna, I'm going to annoy her. So it was just a horrible situation. In the end, both of them moved out, and I only kept in touch with Magdalena. I kind of lost contact with Anna, but I kept in touch with Magdalena for quite a long time after I left that place, but I ultimately lost touch with her as well. Who knows, maybe she's watching now. Hello, Magdalena, if you are. I believe she got married and had a family and things like that. I'm sure Anna's in the same situation. But after they left, another Polish girl moved in, Alexandra. Now, there was something weird going on with her because she was a model. And this sounds like some crazy boast, some crazy lie. Oh, I used to live with a model, but it's actually true. I never went out with her or anything like that. She just happened to do modeling. But there was something dodgy going on with her because I remember sometime Like, we were out somewhere, and she introduced me to this guy who she claimed was our manager. And I thought, okay, nice to meet you, whatever. But I remember on one occasion, I was in the flat, and Alexandra was in her room, and I hear a knock at the door, and I go to the front door, and it's this guy who I've been told is her manager. And not thinking anything of it, he goes to me, is Alexandra in? And I say, yeah, she's in. Come in. And so I let him in, and Alexandra comes out of her room, and she's like acting really awkward, and she's like to this guy, oh, hi, and then she gives me this look like she wants to kill me, like just shoots me pure daggers. So he stays for a bit, and then he leaves, and then she comes storming through to my room, and it's like, why the hell did you let him in? And I was like, well, why wouldn't I let him in? You know, if I'm living with someone and someone knocks on the door asking for them, I'm going to say, yeah, they're in, you know, especially if I've already been introduced to this person and I have no reason to think you're trying to avoid them. There was something really shady going on with her and this guy, and I don't know what she was involved in. But yeah, that was really weird. But we remained friends, you know, for a few years afterwards as well. But I've lost contact with all of them in the present day. I do wish I could reconnect with them again just to see how they're doing, but I've lost their email address long ago. I've been through so many Facebook accounts since then. There's no possible way of me reconnecting unless any of them happen to be watching this stream and feel like contacting me, which, you know, you can do. So yeah, I was just taking a few trips down memory lane this week. Yesterday I watched two films that I haven't seen in a long time. The first, well, both Tom Clancy films, and just for the record, I've never read a Tom Clancy book, and as you'll know, I'm not someone who's militaristic at all. I'm not interested in the military. I'm not concerned with political things, and so I watched these films yesterday by Tom Clancy, and one of them was Patriot Games. Oh, hello Tammy in the chat. One of them is Patriot Games, which many of you will know. It's not the first Tom Clancy film, of course. The first Tom Clancy film is The Hunt for Red October, which I'll be honest with you, I don't like. I'm not really a fan of the Hunt for Red October at all. Maybe it's because of Harrison Ford. You know, Harrison Ford is in Patriot Games, and Harrison Ford is in Clear and Present Danger. But those are the only two Tom Clancy films that he's in. So Patriot Games is interesting to me because it concerns the IRA and Irish politics and things like that. And, you know, I'm not saying it's an accurate representation of anything to do with that, but I'm just saying it concerns that. And you know, I've just shared a whole lot of personal stories about things that went on in the past. And now I'm talking more about entertainment, getting more into more serious real world issues. But I don't know anything about the so-called Troubles in Ireland. I just don't, which seems strange because, you know, I live in the Highlands of Scotland, just across the Irish Sea. And it's true of everyone around here. I don't know anyone around here who knows anything about Irish politics and what the IRA are all about and things like that, even though, of course, a lot of those so-called Troubles spilled over to mainland Britain. I just don't know. Growing up, I was never told anything about it. I don't know anything about it. And sometimes I'll see like an Irishman on Twitter, and they'll be talking about, they're somehow involved in those politics, and they're talking about the IRA and things like that, and Sinn Féin, and I try to understand what's going on. You know, I try to understand what they're saying, what they're trying to communicate, but I just can't, because it seems to me it's very, very complicated. And I've said before, I don't like to have an opinion on subjects that I don't know anything about. And I'm certainly not about to give an opinion on something that's been going on for so long and that is so personal to so many individuals. But I do enjoy films that touch upon that. There's another Harrison Ford film that touches upon that. It's called The Devil's Own with Brad Pitt. It wasn't critically well received, but I've always enjoyed it as a film, and that relates to the IRA and things like that. Faustian Spirit says, I just got done watching Clear and Present Danger while finishing work. Interesting synchronicity. Well, Clear and Present Danger I really, really like as a film. Now, I can't speak to what the book is like because, again, I've never read a Tom Clancy book, but I've always liked Clear and Present Danger. I'd say I like it even better than Patriot Games. But you know what struck me when I was watching Clear and Present Danger yesterday? Is that, so it's about a scandal in the White House, essentially. It's about how the president acts out of emotion, acts out of anger, and ends up getting a lot of people killed in the process, both soldiers and civilians. What was really fascinating about that film, and again, I can't say if the book is the same as this, but what really struck me about watching that film yesterday is that the political parties are never mentioned. You know, it's never mentioned whether this president is a Republican or a Democrat or anything like that, because that's not the point. The point of the film is that you have people in high power doing things that are dishonourable, and you've got this character, Jack Ryan, who is, as one character in the film calls him, the Boy Scout, and he wants everyone to be accountable for their actions and to take responsibility for what they've done wrong, and he's going to do that no matter what it costs him on a personal level. You know, he's willing to go and try and save these soldiers from South America, even though he's obviously risking his life to do that. You know, it just struck me that if that film was made in the present day, you know, the president character would be a Trump-like character, and it would have a very obvious agenda behind it. Or perhaps if it was made by one of those cheaper right-wing conservative film studios, it would be a demon rat. You know, it would be some caricature of President Obama or anything like that. And I just found it so refreshing that here you've got this film, Clear and Present Danger. It's all about politics. The point of the film is about politics, and yet they managed to make it without trying to push some kind of agenda. And again, I can't speak to the book, but I think the fact that it's not mentioned whether the president is a Democrat or Republican, I think that actually strengthens the film, because it more clearly makes the point that, like, regardless of which political party the president and his aides might belong to, none of them are immune from corruption. If they tried to make some partisan point with the film, it definitely would have weakened the film. So that's what really struck me while I was watching Clear and Present Danger yesterday. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. Now, what I was going to do, and what I am going to do, is I'm going to speak about 3 YouTubers that I find of interest, and then I'm going to talk about the Australian police abuses, and then I'm going to talk about the latest Loch Ness Monster sighting, and then I'm going to answer some questions from Curious Cat. I've got a lot of them, 12 questions in total. I am going to take a break now, because you know what happens when I don't have a break, my voice gives out. And what happened this week was that when I read out the blurb for my game earlier, what happened is that I mentioned that one of the influences for my game was ActRaiser. Now, ActRaiser was a game for the Super Nintendo. I played it as a kid, and I always thought it was a great game. It's a god game where you play as an angel. But what was interesting about that game is that it was a hybrid platform game and god game. So what you had to do was that as God, you had to incarnate into the world, play a platform game in which you cleared an area of monsters, and then it switched to a god game where you had to build up a settlement in that area. And sometimes, you know, when problems occurred, you had to incarnate once again to deal with more monsters. Well, out of nowhere in the last 3 days, they released a reimagining of the game. And what happened was that a trailer was released one day, and I think it was on the same day or the day after the game was released. Like, no one knew this was coming, no one knew this was happening. And I think it was Andrew just a few days ago, he said to me, "Have you heard about the new ActRaiser?" And I was like, "New ActRaiser? What? How could I possibly have missed this?" But again, they announced it one day, released it the next. And so I bought it, and I played it, and it is a reimagining. It's not just an HD remake of the original game. It is a complete reimagining. There's loads of new elements. And as something of a purist, I was a bit put off at first by some of the new elements they'd added. But having played it more since, I've really been enjoying myself. And so for the break, I've got a recording of my first game of ActRaiser Renaissance, which is available on Steam. It's available for just about everything, as far as I can tell, but it's available on Steam, which is where I bought it. So yeah, here's 10 or so minutes of my first time playing ActRaiser Renaissance. Now, it looks like I've been playing that game to death. It looks like I'm a stone cold expert at the game, given the way I play it, but that's just because I'm good at video games naturally. Actually, the game is very different from the one I grew up playing. So yeah, I'm going to go behind the scenes now, take a break, and I just leave you with this footage of ActRaiser. So I'll be back very shortly to talk about 3 very interesting YouTube personalities that I enjoy watching. Sorry, I just have to wait until the screen catches up. It's a technical thing I won't bore you with. I just need to make sure this is actually going to play okay. But no, Faustian Spirit asked, does this game have a block or parry? And the original game didn't. And when I play a new game, even if it's a remake of an older game or a reimagining, as is the case in this one, I don't look at instructions first. I just play the game. And so after I started playing the game, as you saw there, that was my first time playing. I actually started looking into this remake, and apparently this remake does have a block function, though I don't know how to do it yet, and I doubt it would have helped much against that centaur, big, massive creature. But see, obviously that game is very different from the kind of game I'm making, but the reason I listed it as an inspiration and when I entered that competition is just because it was the first time I ever played a game like that, a god game like that. And what makes me uncomfortable about that game, and something that is not true of my game, is that you are playing as God. So this angel is referring to you as Lord, the people are praying to you, and things like that. I'm not really comfortable with that. That's why in my game you're playing as an archangel. And of course my game is a whole lot more dark than that game. It's more realistic. That's a very cartoony kind of game. The game I'm making is not at all. And again, it's very Old Testament in its tone. But ActRaiser is a great game, and it still is a great game. I like the new enhancements they've added to it. And what happens throughout the game is that you move from land to land, you clear the monsters out, and people build there. But then the people in these different lands, they start interacting with one another, they start trading with one another. And maybe, like, I remember in the original game, in one land, they live in a cold climate, so they're very cold most of the time. But then in another land they have sheep, so you're able to take the wool that's produced in one land and give it to another land. And it's a very, very good game. It's a very unique game, and although the game I'm making is nothing like it, I do list it as one of the inspirations. The game I'm making is far closer to the Seven Kingdoms games than it is anything else, but again, I'm trying to make it entirely unique. So thus far in the stream, I've talked about my hardback book is coming out. I've talked about the video game I'm developing. I've talked about the second David Bowie album and his official catalogue. I've talked about Ice-T and Ice Cube and how I got into them through one of my sister's boyfriends who was like my older brother. I talked about my 2 Polish flatmates that I used to live with. Talked about 2 Tom Clancy films. Another thing that's been happening, I think the thing I've seen the most on social media is, of course, the police abuses in Australia. I've seen all kinds of disturbing footage from Australia. Now, whenever you see things like that, you've got to always bear in mind, of course, that you're seeing always a small percentage of the interactions that police have with the public. That much is absolutely true, so we've got to be level-headed about this. But the fact remains that those incidents are those incidents, and they happened, and they're inexcusable. I don't know why Australia, out of all of the Western countries, seems to have gone absolutely crazy in its approach here. But I saw, not on YouTube, I highly doubt this is on YouTube, but it was on BitChute. I think I actually watched it on Odyssey, but I'm sure it's on BitChute as well. There was this ex-Australian police officer. In fact, he left the Australian police force, or one of their police forces at least, last year at some point in protest over how the so-called pandemic was being handled and the way that police were treating citizens, essentially. And he made a video saying that his greatest concern would be that when this was all over, there was going to be a huge increase in police suicides due to their inability to live with what they did during this period. Now, I actually highly doubt that, purely because that has never happened in history. I can't recall a time in history where you have some kind of force, like a police force, they do something because the government told them to, and then later on, a significant number of them commit suicide out of guilt. If that happens, it will be the first time in history. So, obviously there will be some that are that will be remorseful, as they should be, because there was one piece of footage in particular where this citizen straight up asked one of these police officers, he's dressed like a bloody stormtrooper, straight up asked him, how can you justify doing these things? And the police officer said, well, I don't like it. I don't like doing these things, but I'm just following orders essentially. That's just not an acceptable excuse, and I that is always applied hypocritically as well. If they're on our side, they were just following orders, but if they're the enemy, then following orders is never an excuse. No, it's never an excuse. And they will suffer for it. I don't think that, like this Australian policeman thinks they're going to start killing themselves, but if they have a conscience at all, they're going to deeply regret doing what they're doing here. Now, someone asked me a question on Curious Cat that actually relates to what's going on in Australia, but all I can say about what's going on just now with the madness that has gripped the Western world is that, those of us who know what's happening, all we have to do is stay the course. All we have to do is endure, essentially, because this state of affairs cannot last. Those police abuses in Australia cannot go on forever. The madness that is being sold to us as an approach to this so-called pandemic, that is unsustainable. It cannot last. So much of the madness that is being pushed in the Western world, like the gender ideology, for example, the idea that men and women are interchangeable, that it just simply cannot last. And that's one thing that should be heartening to us, is that all we have to do is endure. And I've got to encourage people now, as I have done before, to make the best use of their time, because when this is all over, you're going to have people looking back with deep regret, either because, like those police officers, they took part in the brutality against citizens who just wanted to open their business in some cases, or they're simply going to be people who look back and regret because they spent the last 2 years doing nothing but obsessing over this situation when they really had no power. It's one thing if you're in a position to make change. It's one thing to actually spend time making that change, but for the most part, people aren't in such a position. What they're essentially doing is doom scrolling, and they're going to regret spending 2 years having done that. That's why I make a point of being productive, whether it's writing or working on my video game, because I know that I've got to make the best use of my time. And I thought the title of this episode was very appropriate, Lost to Time, because I started talking about my video game, which involves supposed lost civilizations. They have been lost to time, but so much is being lost to time even now, because people aren't appreciating the fact that they are, no matter how dire external circumstances are, they are alive and their mortal life is finite, so they best make the best use of the time that they have. By the way, when I was trying to think of there's 7 nations that you can choose from in my game, and it was very hard to choose which lost civilizations / lost nations I should include. In the end, I have decided on all 7, and I'll tell you what they are. I have to open up my design document to tell you. So there's Agartha, that's the inner Hollow Earth individuals. And by the way, I'm not saying these cultures exist, certainly not in the way that I'm presenting them, but these are supposed lost civilizations, lost nations that I decided to include. So you've got Agartha, Atlantis, Hyperborea. In all probability, that was what the Greeks used to call Iceland, but it's one more supposed advanced civilization that was lost. Iram, as I said earlier, that is a city. There's not much information about this. There's not many references to it. But Iram is a city briefly mentioned in the Quran, and the Quran mentions that this city of Iram of the Pillars it was called, apparently God destroyed it with a sandstorm for its hubris, which makes it perfect, the perfect kind of material for this game. So there's Iram. Then we have Mu. Mu is supposed to be a lost continent in the Pacific Ocean. Most famously, it was written about by James Churchward. Remember, I told you that story before. I think at the time I called him a Danish sailor. I'm not sure if he was Danish, but this sailor I just met I met once, and because I'm someone who doesn't like small talk, I got speaking to him about all kinds of things, and I just happened to mention at one point that I was interested in lost civilizations, lost continents, and things like that. And I mentioned that I was struggling to get hold of a certain book, and that book was The Lost Continent of Mu by James Churchward. So I had this conversation with this guy who had never met before, and then like a week later I got a package in the post, and he sailed around the world. I think it was in the Merchant Navy or something like that, and he'd found the book. I mentioned to him to him once, and he'd found it in some port, and he sent it to me, which was obviously really nice. But yes, Mu is supposed to be a lost continent in the Pacific Ocean. Then you have Lemuria, which is supposed to be a lost continent in the Indian Ocean. Now, Lemuria, I think, is very strongly associated with Helena Blavatsky and her supposed psychic reading. She said a lot about Lemuria and what the entities on that continent were like. But do you know how Lemuria got its name? It's because the idea that there was a lost land in the Indian Ocean was originally conceived of to explain the migration habits of lemurs, because these lemurs would jump to their deaths, as lemurs are famous for doing. And it was theorized that, what if at one point there was a land in the Indian Ocean, and these lemurs have some kind of ancestral memory, and they're trying to get back to their land. Hence, you have Lemuria. It's literally named after lemurs. But there's also another dimension to Lemuria, because there are Indian nationalists. They theorize that this place, Lemuria, they call it something else. They theorize it was the cradle of Indian civilization, and it's a very political belief. This is a horrible comparison, so I'm going to make the comparison, and then I'm going to clarify it. But the Nazis, for example, they had, especially Heinrich Himmler, they had certain ideas about the origins of the Aryan peoples, and those ideas involved Atlantis and Thule and things like that. It's very similar to these Indian nationalists that I'm talking about. Now, I'm not comparing those Indian nationalists to the National Socialists of the 1930s in Germany. I'm just saying that there's a parallel in the way that you have this mythology, this idea about a lost land, and it's intimately tied in with politics in some way. The only comparison I can think of is these occult Nazi ideas concerning Thule and Atlantis and the root races, which itself came from individuals like Blavatsky and so forth. But yeah, highly interesting subject. And again, it's perfect for me because I know these subjects inside out. So when I'm making this game, my only concern is doing the artwork and coding, which is hard enough. Research is not really an issue because I know these subjects. So there's Lemuria, and finally we have Shambhala. Now Shambhala is a mystical kingdom that was supposed to at one point have existed in the area now known as Tibet. And it's more commonly known as Shangri-La, but actually Shangri-La is from a fictional book called Lost Horizons from the early 20th century. And the author of that book almost certainly used Shambhala as his inspiration for this Shangri-La, but the actual original myth talks about a place called Shambhala, not Shangri-La, so it's Shambhala. So those are my 7 nations that are going to be in the game, and I really wanted to have nations from different parts of the world, and although you couldn't see it in that screenshot because the figures are too small, they're really small figures, but the Atlanteans are white-skinned, the Lemurians are brown-skinned because they're in the Indian Ocean, so I've based their culture, that their culture has Indian features in the game, and what I really wanted was some kind of Asian lost civilization, but I couldn't find any. There's all kinds of really fascinating ruins off the coast of Japan, but in Japan itself, there's no real legend. That they don't have an equivalent of Atlantis in Japan, unfortunately. So there was really nothing solid to base it on. I could have made up some kind of Asian-inspired nation and just said that, those ruins underwater around Japan, they once belonged to this nation. But I didn't want to make my own nation up from scratch. I wanted everything to have a historical, real-world basis. So unfortunately, the closest thing I got to an Asian lost civilization or lost nation was Shambhala, which I think is close enough, in all honesty. So those are the 7 nations. And I can add more with time, but I've got to get the base game built first. And now I'm going to talk about a very fascinating Loch Ness Monster sighting. One that I unfortunately don't buy, but I'm going to let you see this footage. So the story here is that someone was flying a drone over this beach at Loch Ness and they caught this footage. So there's no sound to it. Now at first, and this is linked in the description box so you can go and watch it, look at it for yourself. But you see that shape there? So this guy, he claims he was just filming a beach at Loch Ness just to get some nice footage of the beach, when he noticed later, or someone alerted him to the fact later on, that this weird image was in it. This very, very plesiosaur, there you go, I think that's the best we're going to get here. This very, very plesiosaur looking image. You can see it's got the long neck here, you got the body here, and that is my first objection to this footage. It's too perfect. If you asked someone to draw the Loch Ness Monster, that is what they would draw. And that's what makes me suspicious of the footage. I mean, it looks kind of good. It does look good. It does look convincing. But it's too perfect. Let's just say he faked this, right? He would have been better off making a more amorphous shape. You know, making something a little more ambiguous. Because this is just the perfect plesiosaur, essentially. And that's one of the reasons I don't buy it. I also don't buy the fact that he just so happened to be filming that beach from that top-down angle, and like half of the view is the water. If you were just filming the beach, why would you position it like that? And it seems to me that he, I don't know, it just seems a bit suspicious to me. I just don't buy it. I just don't believe it at all. And if that footage was as convincing as it seems to be, this would be a major news story. Instead, it was just by pure chance that I came across it. But if that footage was as convincing as it seems to be, it would be on the news 24/7 non-stop. The Loch Ness Monster has been found. It has been captured. So there's those who pay attention to these things, those who are focused on such sightings. It's pretty obvious that they have their reasons not to bestow that footage with too much legitimacy. But it's one more Loch Ness Monster sighting, or supposed Loch Ness Monster sighting for the pot. And so I'll just leave you with it, I guess. And again, everything I'm talking about is linked in the description box below. So, now to conclude this video with the questions. Now, I noticed that my screen here is positioned weirdly at the... Can I move this while OBS is recording? Apparently I can, unless it's going to stop streaming. I don't know. Okay, so now on to the questions from Curious Cat. Okay, so the first one, not a question, but it needs to be said. You look incomplete without your hair and beard. Okay, next question. As you've gone along on the spiritual path, have you become more patient with people's misery or less so? It depends in which way you interpret that question. If by patient you mean emotionally patient, as in, you know, am I able to bear with people longer than I once did? The answer is yes, because that's just a natural consequence of engaging in spirituality, contemplation and so forth, and becoming more distant from that phenomenon that arises, as I explain in chapter 3 of this book. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm willing to put up with people's misery, because sometimes people enjoy dwelling in their misery. Sometimes people have victimhood and suffering as an egoic identity, and they don't want to let go of that because it's how they understand themselves in the world. And so if someone is miserable through essentially their own choice because they want to indulge in that kind of self-pity, then you should have nothing but short patience with them, because you can't help someone who, as they say, doesn't want to help themselves, And associating with such an individual is only going to threaten to bring you down experientially. So if we're talking about emotional patience, then yes, that has definitely improved over time, but that doesn't mean I'm willing to entertain and indulge someone's self-pity and their desire to be a victim for all of their life, because I'm certainly not willing to do that. Any YouTube channels or books that talk about Christianity from a mystic perspective that you would recommend? Thanks in advance. Well, you know what? I've got just the thing right here. This fine book, Experiential Spirituality, The Mystic Answer to Everything, written by someone called David McMurdo. You know, they say that he's both wise and handsome. So there's that. But I assume you already know about that. As far as Christian mysticism specifically, very few, but I will give you a deep cut. Not literally YouTube. I mean, I will share with you a deep cut, and I forgot to put him in the description box, but I will. There's a YouTube channel here. It used to be called Ted Nottingham, but now he goes by Theodore Nottingham, which is his full name. And he is someone, I believe he belongs to the Orthodox Church, but he's ironically kind of unorthodox because, yeah, he's someone who is focused on Christian mysticism, but he'll talk about the Gospel of Thomas and things like that. That's why I say he's a bit unorthodox. But he is really focused on Christian mysticism. You might find his channel a bit dry. You know, here I'm talking about all kinds of things. I'm trying to bring spirituality into it where possible, whether it's video games, films, music, so forth. Sometimes I just like to have a laugh, share some stories from the old days as I was before. Theodore Nottingham, very dry, very stern, very serious, which may appeal to you or it may not. But after this stream, I'll be sure to link to him in the description box below. But as far as Christian mysticism is concerned specifically, he's the only one that really comes to mind. Of course, there are plenty of dead individuals who spoke from a Christian mystic perspective. St. Teresa of Avila, her book, The Interior Castle, I own it on Amazon. All kinds of Christian mystics like that. Thomas Merton, a Catholic mystic from the 20th century. All kinds of names like that. But I assume that you're already familiar with them. Last, but by no means least, would be someone like Meister Eckhart, a Catholic mystic from the 13th century. He's pretty much the standard when it comes to Christian mysticism, I would say. Not a serious question, but what do you think of Bill Hicks' Just a Ride sketch? I actually mentioned that in a recent stream. I said that it's a great little monologue that he went on. Essentially Bill Hicks just talking about how life shouldn't be taken too seriously because, as he said, it's just a ride. And that's true. You know, every spiritual experience I've had left me with the impression that first of all, life made sense in a way that I couldn't articulate when I'd returned to my mortal self. And second of all, that in a weird way it was funny and it wasn't to be taken as seriously as most souls take it. So obviously Bill Hicks was a comedian. He wasn't known as a mystic and not even known for his religion, very crude guy and things like that. But he had some insight in giving that monologue for sure. Have you ever heard of Rocky Erickson? He is a local legend around Texas for pioneering psychedelic rock, but he was caught with 2 joints of marijuana and put in an insane asylum with pedophiles, rapists, and murderers. They treated him with electroshock therapy, and when he was let out, he started saying more about gremlins and demons. I'd be interested what you think about his music and the message they convey. Thanks. Well, I did listen to those 2 tracks that you sent, and I enjoyed them musically, but I didn't necessarily understand the point he was trying to make in them. But I did listen to those tracks, and I did enjoy them. I'd never actually heard of this individual, and it is very disturbing what they used to do to people, even just last century, as far as so-called medical treatments are concerned. This is just one more reason that mantras like trust the science are so silly, because obviously, you know, scientists and the experts have said and done all kinds of erroneous, terrible things in the past that people should be fully aware of. But again, there's this idea that in the modern day we've somehow reached the point, we've reached an end point where, okay, they got some things wrong in the past, But now we've got it right. Now the experts definitely know what they're doing, and they're not fallible. But the truth is, of course, science is always correcting itself. Scientists are always learning, and there is no such thing as an end point. And for as long as human beings are the ones managing the science, and as long as human beings have to serve as the experts, there will always be failures, and so that's just never going to change. What is best in life? Is it to crush your enemies, to see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of their women? Well, I'd love to agree with Conan there, but this is experiential spirituality, so I'm going to have to disagree. What is best in life is to not be attached to anything in this world. Not to be apathetic, as I say, you've got to make the best use of the time that you have here to be as creative and productive as possible. But what's best in life is to not be attached. So even though you have your focuses, your projects that you're working on, you want to see them done, and you set about engaging in them passionately, if it all falls apart, or if it amounts to nothing, or if it's all taken away from you because you're not attached to it, you don't incur any suffering for that. So what is best in life is to not be attached to anything and to acknowledge God. That is what is best in life. Why did Yeshua and his followers direct his message to those who would experience 70 AD? Now, there's many angles that question could be asked from, but essentially, 70 AD, obviously, aside from the fact that it brought the destruction of Jerusalem, what that represented was the end of the Old Covenant, the finality of the Old Covenant, and Yeshua's mission was to... where's the hidden hand? I mentioned to you earlier, where's the hidden hand? I was talking about how I subscribed to Revenge of the Sis's Patreon, and I was watching some of their Patreon exclusive live streams, and I swear I saw you in the chat. But maybe it wasn't you, because now that I think about it, I don't think they were called Where's the Hidden Hand. I think they were just called The Hidden Hand, so maybe it wasn't you, but I thought it was you in Revenge of the Sis's Patreon exclusive chats. But Yeshua's mission was to gather as many souls as possible to make that transition from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant before the end came in 70 AD. Now, when Yeshua was alive himself, his focus was only on his own Jewish people, because he was the Jewish Messiah. As he said himself, I have come only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But then, of course, the Apostle Paul, he was the apostle to the Gentiles, so he was to gather as many Gentiles in as possible before 70 AD came. And so that's why Yeshua was gathering his flock. It's because, as the Apostle Paul explained in the book of Romans, a promise had been made to the Jewish people, and through Yeshua, God was fulfilling that promise. This was their chance to be part of the kingdom of God, to be part of the new covenant that was coming in. But of course, many of the Jews, especially the religious Jews, the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees, they rejected that because they rejected Yeshua and his apostles. So I hope I understood the intent, the angle your question was coming from there. That's the reason for it. And again, that's what my game is, the concept my game is based around, is that you've got this apocalyptic moment. You've got this apocalyptic moment that is unavoidable. The destruction of Atlantis is set in stone, just as the destruction of Jerusalem was set in stone. And so what your mission is as the player is to save as many souls as possible, just as it was the mission of Yeshua and his apostles to save as many souls as possible before the destruction, which was inevitable, which I think is a really interesting premise. Shane says, if detachment is a means of avoiding suffering, doesn't that reduce the chances of finding God via some level of necessary suffering? I think it's a great question, by the way. It's a great question. I like it when people find, I'm sure you're not meaning it in this way, this is the way I'm expressing it. I like it when people try and find loopholes or try and find gotchas. And again, that sounds bad. I know that's not your intent, but I like when people ask questions like that, difficult questions. But I think that anyone who would even concern themselves with detachment has suffered enough enough to care about that in the first place. You know, someone who hasn't suffered to any great degree in their life isn't going to care about detaching because they're happy indulging in the world, and they take the suffering as just something that comes with life. So when someone gets to the point where they're concerning themselves with detachment, I think they're ready to move on and come to know God, essentially. Where's the Hidden Hand says, it's another guy with a slightly different name, but I do watch Revenge of the Sis when Mersh isn't banning me. Yeah, Mersh, again, I spoke well of him earlier, and I'll speak well of him again because, he did take the time to teach me how to do these things, but Mersh, he's always on a hair trigger, let's just say. He's always ready to ban someone. You have to be kind of cautious, even joking with him, just in case he takes it the wrong way, and you end up featured on Revenge of the Sis because you said something in chat that you meant as a joke. The Uncle Greg Show says, is it a means of avoiding suffering though, or is that simply a consequence of the practice? Meaning that if your attachment is motivated by avoiding suffering, then you may find you've become attached to the pursuit of eliminating suffering. Another dynamite question. That's possible. That's absolutely possible. That's why it's necessary, as I explain in the book, it's possible, to become attached to the pursuit of non-attachment. In fact, there was a wonderful, funny you should say that, there was a wonderful Zen quote that someone shared. Can I possibly find this now? I think I can. Well, actually, it wasn't a Zen quote, but this individual who's very into Zen, the Zen philosophy, said this: chasing any brand of success is a proof of failure. The ultimate success is not needing to succeed. And that's why I often present a very unconcerned attitude, I guess, that I think that many religionists find off-putting because they perceive me as not taking things seriously enough. Like, especially if they watch live streams like this where I'm talking about films I watch, music I listen to, I'm thinking about the old days, like the stories I shared earlier. Religionists might listen to a stream like this and think I'm not concerned with those things. I should be focusing on what they understand as spirituality 100%. But yeah, that's to kind of take it too seriously, almost. I think it's enough to understand the benefit of attachment and not have it be some kind of idol, which it can, as the Uncle Greg Show implied, it can very easily become some kind of idol. All that matters is that you understand the value of attachment and you're able to perceive whether or not you are still overly invested in things of this world, whether it's emotionally or intellectually, and that is enough. There's no need to obsess over it, for sure. Okay, here's another interesting question. If ascribing the work of the Father to the devil is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, then does that mean hating existence is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit? You could construe it that way, but that's definitely not what Yeshua was suggesting when he said it. I mean, I don't know what Yeshua's take on that would have been, because I don't think there were many individuals in first century Palestine hating existence in the way that so many nihilists do now. But just for clarification for anyone who doesn't know what that question is referring to, when the Pharisees accused Yeshua of working for Beelzebub and essentially saying that his miracles came from the powers of darkness, that's when Yeshua mentioned blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. Because to blaspheme the Holy Spirit is to witness or to understand, to see something of the powers of God and to ascribe them to the works of darkness. And the reason that the Bible describes it as an unforgivable sin is that if you think that the power of God is evil, is coming from evil, then you won't have anything to do with the power of God, and therefore you shut yourself off from salvation. That's why in the Hebraic way of anthropomorphizing God and having him be this zealous judge, they describe that sin as being unforgivable. But what it really means is that because they're ascribing these divine powers to darkness, they're obviously not going to have anything to do with those powers, therefore they can't be saved. So that's where that question originates. So yeah, I guess in that sense, if it's blasphemy of the Holy Spirit to attribute the powers of God to evil, or the works of God to evil, if creation is a work of God, could it be blasphemy of the Holy Spirit to hate the world? I guess it could be, but it's certainly not what Yeshua was getting at, and I'm sure it didn't even occur to Yeshua at the time. Faustian Spirit says, harmony between attachment and detachment is the way. Too much concern for the material plane leads to suffering. Sorry, whenever someone says leads to suffering, I just immediately think of Yoda. Too much concern for the material plane leads to suffering, as does too much detachment from it. Yep, I think that's absolutely true. Balance is very necessary. This is why Buddha was wise in conceiving of his middle way, because Buddha, being someone who was a Hindu, raised a Hindu, obviously, and like Yeshua, he had no intention of starting a new religion called Buddhism. He was essentially just a Hindu teacher himself. But Buddha saw the folly, because I don't know how many of you know the story of Buddha, but Buddha, and like with Yeshua, there's many accounts of his childhood and many tales of what happened, but broadly speaking, the story goes that Buddha was raised in very auspicious circumstances, a very wealthy family, but he was always dissatisfied. And at one point, he was never allowed to see the outside world because his parents felt that it would taint him somehow. But one of his assistants took him outside the city on 3 occasions, and on one occasion he saw a person dying of disease, and another person he saw, another case he saw death. He witnessed these things that awoke him to the reality of suffering in the world, and that consumed his mind from that point forth. He was really disturbed by the presence of suffering, and so even though he was brought up in these wealthy circumstances and he eventually had a wife and child, he abandoned all of it. He just left it all behind and went out into the wilderness to find enlightenment. And the story of him finding enlightenment under the Bodhi tree is very reminiscent of Yeshua in the wilderness with Satan, because just as Satan arose in the wilderness to tempt Yeshua, so the demon Mara, who is basically Satan in Buddhism, he arose to tempt Buddha in very similar ways. There's so many interesting parallels between Jesus and Buddha, Yeshua and Buddha. But the point is that Buddha, when he was trying to find enlightenment, when he was seeking nirvana, he encountered all of these Hindu gurus, and they all had their ways of mortifying the flesh. Like, some of them would inflict as much pain on themselves as possible, others would starve themselves. And Buddha became part of a group that would, amongst other things, starve themselves. It was said that, it's interesting, how you've got that portrayal of Buddha as a really fat figure? That is not actually Buddha. That's a Chinese Buddhist from actually relatively modern history. That's not meant to be Buddha. Buddha would have been a very, very thin guy because he went through these ascetic practices, and eventually he realized that no, starving yourself like this and inflicting all this physical suffering, that this can't be the way to enlightenment. And that's how he ultimately conceived of the middle way, where there has to be a balance between not indulging yourself, in terms of food, not being a glutton, but also not starving yourself. And that's how the Buddhist middle way was born, and that is what took Buddha to enlightenment. Faustian Spirit says, it becomes a strange concept though, say when witnessing the evils in this world. Hard to find a peace with that. That is a difficult issue for many, and maybe that's something I should speak about in a future episode more fully rather than just give a short answer here. But what really helps is the sure knowledge that things happen for, this sounds so cliched, but things happen for a reason, and that God has everything in hand, and that kind of certainty, that kind of sure knowledge can only come through experiential spirituality, and that's why it's so necessary to emphasize it. Where's the Hidden Hand says, the churches had a brilliant chance to make themselves relevant again during COVID in 1984. I thought you'd made a typo there, but you didn't. It was a pun. Convid 1984. They failed completely. Yes, they have. In fact, I'm not going to say that, but yes, let's just say I agree with you. Why has your interpretation of Christianity been so rare throughout history? Because the truth is not found by most individuals, and this is something affirmed by every great mystic. Yeshua himself said, narrow is the way that leads to life and broad is the way that leads to destruction. This is one thing that's really bizarre and never occurs to the vast majority of Christians, is that a lot of Christians will take pride in how big their religion is in terms of numbers. So let's say you're counting both Catholics and Protestants together and just lumping them as Christians. You're talking about 2 billion souls in this world, and Christians will often take pride in the fact that, look, we've got the biggest, most powerful religion in the world. So you can see straight away that their focus is worldly. They're focusing on worldly power. So there's something off there from the very beginning. But they never think to try and reconcile that with what Jesus said, what Yeshua said about his own followers. Yeshua made clear that his genuine followers would be the persecuted ones. They would be the hated ones. They would be oppressed and despised by the world. That's not something that has been true of Christianity for the last 1700 years, so there's an obvious disparity there. Now, the reason quite simply is that the genuine Christianity that Yeshua talked about was what people call now mysticism, Christian mysticism. That's what it is, and it's the same is true in every religion. There's the wide umbrella that is for the religionists, where the focus is theology, salvation through theology, essentially believing the right stuff. And then there is the narrow path that is the mystic approach to whatever tradition one might belong to. So the reason my interpretation of Christianity is so rare is the reason that the mystic interpretation of any religion is so rare is that most individuals want to focus on the intellectual aspects of the religion, again, the theology, the doctrine, the dogma, and so forth, because it's easier and because they can use it for worldly ends. But the mystic approach is very, very different from that, and it's the narrow path that Yeshua talked about, something that most individuals won't even entertain or at all, essentially. What is the meaning of Revelation 14:11? So Revelation 14:11 is the verse where that talks about the smoke of their torment arising forever. Whose torment? The torment of those who took the mark of the beast, essentially. So this question, and to answer this question, there needs to be a little bit of elaboration. The mark of the beast. Well, first of all, the book of Revelation talks about events that took place in the 1st century, so it's got nothing to do with what's going on now. And I can't help but cringe a little bit whenever I see something being called the mark of the beast, because it's not the mark of the beast. People have been calling things the mark of the beast for the last 2,000 years. Nothing is the mark of the beast, and it won't be again, because it all happened in the 1st century. But the mark of the beast was never a literal mark of any kind. The mark of the beast was subservience to the worldly order at the time, which was Nero's reign. There was Nero and his servants and his allies, and then there were the Christians that they persecuted to death. So to take the mark of the beast was to serve the beast, Nero, and be one of his willing accomplices, essentially. And the enemies of those who... There was the mark of the beast and the sign of the Lamb, those who followed Yeshua, essentially. And so in the 1st century, you had these opposing forces. And that's still relevant today. I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the abuses of the Australian police. That's highly relevant today, even though these events took place in the past, because those police, in doing what they're doing and just following orders, they are following the beast system. Christians are right to use that term, the beast system. Now, while the events of Revelation took place in the 1st century, you can call something the beast system because history repeats itself. And here again we have this regime that certainly has malevolent intent, and you have these servants of the regime that are doing all kinds of things and justifying it to themselves in all kinds of ways. And so they are the modern equivalent, certainly, of those who have taken the mark of the beast, and they will suffer the consequence for doing so. But as for that verse in particular, that verse is often cited as an example or proof of eternal torment. But notice that the verse doesn't say that the torment of those individuals goes on forever. It says that the smoke of their torment rises forever. It's a very different thing. And what that basically is saying is that the memory or the understanding or the knowledge of their torment rises forever. That's what it essentially refers to. And that's a very important distinction to make. Those individuals went down in infamy, and they're not remembered now. And if they are remembered, they're remembered as persecutors, and that's what's going. That's the fate of those individuals who are going along with the agenda in the present day as well. And Tate says it there: marker of the beast on forehead and hands, thoughts forehead and deeds hands. Precisely, that is precisely what it means. It's got nothing to do with a microchip, a barcode, or anything like that. The Uncle Greg Show says, I like the image of Shiva dancing, destroying and creating the world at the same time. But the dance implies, like Bill Hicks was saying, that it's all a game, so to speak. Yes, and that's certainly the sense one gets in transcendent experiences. In fact, in transcendent experiences, you know everything. Like, you can make sense of everything to the point where you could almost cry with laughter. Everything just seems so funny because in that place, everything seems so obvious. But of course, when you return to your mortal self, you can't articulate it because the understanding you had, it was like gnosis. It can't be conceived of intellectually, much less can it be articulated verbally. So you're left with this kind of fleshly frustration where you had a grasp on something spiritually, but now you can no longer articulate it. Agaratos Henosis says, Australia has a new insane security law where police can use suspects' social media and post things against their will. I also heard Google can arrest people who are in proximity to crime scenes. Yeah, of all the countries to go absolutely crazy, Australia wouldn't have been high on my list. And likewise, of all the countries to be the shining example of how this whole thing should have been handled, I wouldn't have expected the Scandinavian countries to be among them. But like Sweden, Norway, life there is pretty much back to normal. And the media and government figures in other countries are trying so desperately not to bring up Sweden and Norway because they just demolish the entire narrative. And our leaders here, like in the United Kingdom and in Australia, and Biden over in the United States, they can't risk acknowledging that because it means revealing the truth, which is that all of this, the lockdown, the masks, all these mandates, it was for nothing. They imposed these restrictions on individuals. They caused all of this suffering for absolutely nothing. Unfathomable suffering, by the way. All the suicides, all the missed cancers that have occurred. They've inflicted so much suffering and they know it. So they cannot possibly at this point acknowledge the obvious, that it was all for nothing. But it was all for nothing. All anyone ever achieved wearing those stupid masks was killing a few sea turtles, because there's now like 2 billion of them floating in the oceans. Shiva is dancing on the... Tate says, Shiva is dancing on the demon of forgetfulness who is enamored with the world's serpent. Agaratus Henosis says, Count Dankula's second channel touches on those invasive laws. Yeah, I'm subscribed to his second channel. Count Dankula's an interesting guy. I wouldn't be friends with him. I don't think we're the kind of individuals who would be friends in real life. We're just too different for that. But yeah, I enjoy his content. Where's the Head in Hand says, Sweden drop all restrictions tomorrow. Nothing. Okay. Okay, one person here says King David. I don't know what that means or is referring to. I'm trying to think if it's some biblical question in some way, but say that a man works in one of the life sciences and the research he works requires animal testing. Considering how horrific the cruelties that are imposed on those critters, how much danger is that man of ending up in the lake of fire? Is cruelty to animals permissible for the sake of furthering scientific knowledge? Well, this is one of those issues that it's hard to just give a definite moral answer on. You know, if you've read my book, chapter 10, I think it is, I talk about how one must be guided. In fact, I talk about it as early as chapter 3. One must be guided by their conscience. So I can't speak definitively on these things, but what I will say is that I cannot imagine a circumstance where where my conscience would be at ease inflicting deliberate suffering on another living creature. There could be all kinds of hypothetical scenarios, none of which involve producing shampoo, by the way, but there could be all kinds of hypothetical scenarios where you might need to do that in order to obtain some greater good, but it's very unlikely. So, and the thing is, I've watched some disturbing videos of animal experimentation and testing, and I don't just mean like testing healthcare products and things like that. I mean some really screwed up experiments. And I can't help but notice that whenever you see the individuals who conduct those experiments talking, you can tell they're kind of dead. Like in the third chapter of my book, I talk about the logic behind Shakespeare's comment about the eyes being the window to the soul, because consciousness does show itself behind the eyes. And these individuals, I can't help but notice, they're all dead behind the eyes. They don't look at all like individuals who have any kind of connection with their moral compass, with their conscience at all. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I could never envisage a scenario where I could inflict suffering on an animal and be at ease in my conscience. But so that's the best I can say to that. Agoratos Henosis said, I heard from family in the Czech Republic that they are now giving out free healthcare bundles to try to make up on the side effects of the vaccines. We can at least be thankful that those side effects are now being acknowledged, because, there was a point, as many of you will know, where people were just denying that side effects even existed, even though side effects have always existed. No matter how good a medicine or a vaccine is, of course, there's always a risk of side effects, because the biology of human beings is far too diverse to allow for one kind of one-size-fits-all solution to these things. So you knew something was really sinister when they were denying that there was the potential for adverse reaction from these vaccines, because it was so disingenuous. It's just a fact that if you have a vaccine, no matter how good it is, no matter how effective it is, there's always a risk of adverse side effects. So when they start denying that point blank, it's just craziness. So yeah, I'm just grateful that such side effects are at least acknowledged. But what surprises me is that some of the Eastern countries, the Eastern European countries, they also have been going quite hard on the lockdown as far as the pandemic is concerned. Usually I would have thought that, unlike us here in the West, I thought they would have been more sensible in their approach, but in many cases they simply haven't been. I mentioned my Polish flatmates earlier. I'm not actually sure what's going on in Poland as far as lockdown is concerned, whether it's over there or not. Tate says, suffering as well as fear is an energy source for the demiurge. Suffering comes from failing to identify what we truly are. Spirit. Tate, I have to ask, because your statements definitely imply it. Are you actually a Gnostic? Because you do tend to bring things back to Gnosticism quite a lot. Just curious. Where's the Head and Hand says, after a short illness, side effects. Yes, there's been a lot of deaths after a short illness recently. It's been something of a phenomenon. And honestly, I think that many of those who took the vaccine are getting a bit concerned now. I think they're starting to see that something's not quite right. But this is YouTube, so I can't go into that kind of subject matter in too much detail. So I guess I'll end the show there. It's been going on for 2 hours and 20 minutes now. I really want to get back to working on... in fact, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to work on my video game today, because I've been doing it non-stop, and it's just grueling. It's grueling. It's worth it in the end, but it's just Tate says 100%. Okay, fair enough. Just wondering, but it's grueling work. You know, no matter what video game you want to make, it will require a load of art assets, a load of them. And so you're going to be sitting there for hours on ends drawing art assets. So what I've been doing in order to break things up a bit is I've been creating the art assets I need to get to the next stage of coding. So right now what I need to do, you know, I've got, as you saw in that screenshot, I've got a settlement, I've got some units. What I need to do is get those units properly animated, and I need to create a monster layer, because then I can teach the human nations, the AI of the human nations, that if there's a monster layer nearby, then you need to prioritize dealing with that by whatever means, because the AI in this game, there's a whole lot of means you can deal with threats, not just combat. So I need to teach the AI that when a monster layer is nearby, it needs to deal with that threat, because it's the biggest threat that there is in the early game. So yeah, if I just do that, make the art assets I need, and then do the coding, and then go back to make more art assets, and then do more coding. That's a nice way of balancing things out. But there's no doubt about it, it is grueling, tedious work. So as I said, it's my birthday next Sunday, next week. So I don't know if there will be a live stream then or not. We'll see what happens, essentially. But yeah, that's it. Thanks very much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you when I see you.